Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest in the Centre for Carers Circle seminar series. I'm co-director of Circle and deputy director of the Centre for Care, and I'm also part of the leadership group of Sheffield's branch of the NIHR School of Social Care Research, which funded the research we're going to hear about today. So I'm particularly delighted to chair this particular seminar. I did just say before we start that I'd give a bit of a collective apology from colleagues. We've had a Centre for Care Westminster policy breakfast event today on reform to carers allowance, so one of the kind of high profile policy engagement events that we do. So many of our colleagues are there, as is Catherine Brunswick Cole, who's Sheffield's director of SSCR and who also wanted to be here. So apologies from them. I think we also have apologies for one of our speakers, but I'll let Tom talk you through that one. But yeah, delighted to welcome Tom Ryan, who's a recent PhD graduate from the University of Sheffield and now lead for the NIHR SSCR funded project. No one wants to talk about it, exploring transitions in family care for people with learning disabilities. So this builds on Tom's kind of interest around siblings relationships in the context of learning disabilities, and which I think he's also going to draw on today. And yeah, in her absence, just wanted to introduce and acknowledge Elsie Ledger, who's our research trainee in SSCR, which is a role that means she's contributing to a whole range of activity, including this particular project, and she's bringing kind of particular sort of practice expertise in community services for dementia care to all of this work. So I'll hand over to Tom and be back with you later to hear your questions.
Yeah, so as Nathan said, this talk is about a project that we're currently doing, and I'm also going to draw on my PhD a little bit. And also, as Nathan said, Elsie unfortunately couldn't make it. She's on annual leave, but she did help to write these slides, and I do want to kind of acknowledge that we wrote this together and we kind of planned this together, so she does deserve that credit. And I guess if anyone has any issues with any of the presentation, you could email her maybe instead of me if you want to. But yeah, so what will be discussed today. So we're going to think about sibling relationships and what this could mean in the context of care. We're going to introduce the current project that we're doing, and we're going to look at some data around future planning in later life for people with learning disabilities and early themes of our analysis. Broadly speaking, it's sort of the first third of the presentation is kind of about my PhD and what was kind of coming up in a project that wasn't really about care, but kind of occasionally would have these segues into discussions about care and particularly about the future. And then the last two thirds, we're going to move into, as I say, the current project and probably the most interesting part, which is data we've started to collect over the last couple of months. So research overview, just a couple of kind of points on where the data is coming from. So the first project there is disability, sibling relationships, and everyday life, exploring mundane realities as counter stories, which was my PhD, as Nathan mentioned. So I interviewed siblings of people with learning disabilities about their childhoods, and I was really interested in like the idea of how we frame siblinghood and learning disability and how the ways that we frame it can inform kind of deficit understandings of people with learning disabilities as kind of members of families, if that kind of makes sense. So I was really interested in kind of why lots of research is quite negatively focused and why we tend to kind of ignore ideas of joy and humor and love and closeness and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to do a bit of a chat about sibling relationships more generally, bringing it into kind of the stuff around care that was coming up. And then that second project is our current project, and it's a 10-month piece of research working with people with learning disabilities, siblings of people with learning disabilities, and parent carers to explore care transitions in later life and looking to the future. And we're really interested kind of in the role of sibling relationships in this, particularly as a kind of underexplored area. So what is it about kind of being a sibling that maybe means that you come to this later life care stuff a bit differently to, say, a parent carer, for example. But as I say, we'll kind of come on to that in the later part of the presentation. So thinking about siblinghood to begin, these are quite general takes on sibling relationships, but I think it gets kind of that wider understanding sort of moving, or however you want to talk about that, but kind of drawing on Catherine Davis, who's at Sheffield's work, and also a few other people. But Catherine talks about sibling relationships as nuanced and complex, and kind of across all the examples on the board, there's a sense of sort of it being quite a unique relationship, one that's often kind of met with conflict and closeness at the same time. Ideas, for example, in my PhD around humor is something that would bring joy and laughter, but also occasionally teasing and frustration, and sometimes that line being quite blurry. For Punch, on that third bullet point, this is to do with it being a backstage relationship, so sort of rooted in quite like classic Goffman social theory, but ideas around that close proximity and kind of being in the home space, leading to people maybe kind of playing with certain boundaries and pushing each other's buttons in a way that one of my participants referred to as spiky. So they talk about being in a spiky mood and trying to annoy their sibling as that might be one of their like ways of interacting. So basically, the main point of this is that it's quite an open approach to sibling relationships in family sociology. So I was drawing on these ideas to think about sibling relationships, and I was really interested in this idea of kind of an understanding approach to thinking about siblinghood, one that sees conflict as part of that, and one that sees frustration as key a part as maybe joy and closeness and humor. And I was sort of interested as well in how this could potentially raise some concerns around normative ideas of what a good sibling is. So, how do we interrogate maybe ideas around birth order and what your older brother should be teaching you or whatever that might be? And when you bring that into discussion with learning disability, what kind of questions does that raise? And so, thinking about the kind of wider concerns of the field, maybe around how people tend to do siblinghood and disability research, I've kind of pulled this quote from an academic called Meltzer, which I use a lot in presentations when I want to kind of make a point about the field, but really, really quickly and kind of get onto other stuff. I find this to be a particularly useful quote. But she talks about this idea of we kind of get obsessed with what the relationship is not, and we don't really focus on what it is. So she talks about when we do that, sibling relationships that include a person with a disability have traditionally been found wanting or damaged in comparison. And that's in comparison to, I guess, relationships between non-disabled siblings in research. And so, from my perspectives, I was finding that research around siblinghood and learning disability would often focus on things like non-disabled sibling outcomes, and it would talk a lot about things like glass children, which is something that's quite a big TikTok thing at the moment as well. And that's not to say that it doesn't work for some people. And that, well, sorry, actually, I should explain what that is. I'm given a lot of talks about this concept, so sometimes I can jump ahead. But that's kind of this idea that if you have a sibling with learning disabilities or a disabled sibling, your parents will be so busy looking after them that they won't really pay any attention to you, and you're sort of looked through, which is sort of this glass metaphor, I should say, I kind of guess is what they're getting at. And that's not me saying that that's not useful for people, and it definitely is for lots of people. But I guess the point I'm getting at here, drawing on Meltzer's work, is how some of these framings in academic work can shape a certain view of what it is to have a sibling with learning disabilities that maybe reinforces some deficit understandings. So, kind of building on that foundation and what my PhD was doing more generally, kind of started thinking about some of the stuff that was coming up as care in my PhD. And I should say here that that wasn't a specific focus, so to speak. So, it wasn't something that I did tons and tons of work on, and particularly like the conceptual side of it. I know that, like, in the Centre for Care, you've got a lot of very strong kind of like conceptual care work. And this wasn't something that in the PhD I was as focused on. But some of the stuff that was coming up just early on was kind of discussions around sibling care as a sense of understanding of one another, of there being closeness and support over the life course. So as the kind of second project comes onto this notion of being there for each other, but not just in childhood, but as you kind of age and grow up together, and maybe that taking on a specific meaning if you have a sibling with learning disabilities. Allyship and advocacy, again, more general sibling relationships will have this, but when you have a sibling with learning disabilities, I was getting a lot of stories of kind of navigating public and being like in spaces where maybe members of the public were not the most welcoming to you or your family, and how siblings that I was interviewing had many stories of sort of either kind of direct advocacy, but also just like navigating situations in a way to kind of support their sibling through that without drawing attention to it sometimes was one of the ways they did that. And then I've also put down reciprocal care, which is partly because spend a lot of time with Charlie Grosset and was in the same PhD office as him, who's a Centre for Care PhD student. But he writes all about disabled people as carers and kind of questioning that binary of carer and caregiver and care receiver. And I wanted to kind of make it clear here that throughout the stories I was gathering, this care was going both ways, and kind of good opportunity to shout out Charlie's work on that as well. So again, these are all quite common sibling care discussions that you'd find in wider research. However, it can be presented quite differently in disability and siblinghood discussions. I won't go into this in tons of depth here, but in the Q&A, more than happy to talk about it. But one example of this would be like around the young carer phrasing and how that's applied. A lot of the people I interviewed had sort of been just by the nature of having a sibling with learning disabilities, have been kind of expected or encouraged to attend young carer groups. And this had been something that they'd slightly struggled with and didn't necessarily align with that label. And I know that there's quite a lot of academic work that questions and engages with that, and how we can kind of overascribe that sometimes to people just because they have, for example, a sibling with learning disabilities. So there's lots of interesting stuff there. And moving kind of to what in the PhD I found to be the most interesting for the next step of my research and then building this project with Elsie, Sue, and Catherine was around looking to the future. So I was interviewing people about their childhoods, and I was, as a qualitative researcher, you don't want to you don't want to kind of prevent people from talking about stuff, I should say, but I wasn't actually, actively interested in what happens after childhood. But people kind of unanimously across all of my interviews started talking about that. And so I ended up with lots and lots of data that was people sort of saying, oh, this is how I felt about childhood and whatever that might be. And then going on to be, but I am really worried about what happens when my parents can't support my brother or sister, or I'm really worried about what comes next. People sort of talking about how maybe when they were a young, somebody said specifically, for example, on the young carer thing, I didn't feel like a carer growing up, but I will when I'm older. I know that that's going to happen, sort of stuff. So real sense that across everyone I interviewed, there was going to be this shift, and there was going to be kind of a need to talk about the future. And quite unanimously, again, across the data, people weren't really talking about the future with their families. I sort of got into the habit of just asking about that more generally out of interest in the interviews, and quite rare that people had had kind of proper conversations about this. So I did some reading on this and kind of found some academic work that was discussing this. So that paper from Leanne talks about a sibling. They call it like a ticking time bomb, which is really, really interesting. And that's like the title of the paper. So it's a real kind of headline grabbing paper, but it talks about this idea that siblings particularly can feel like they would like to have the conversation, and often the conversation just doesn't go anywhere and people don't feel comfortable talking about it, or the conversation might be shut down. And there's many reasons for this. One that I've got a few on the slide. Some of the ones that we've kind of come across are the idea of it being tied up in discussions of death and dying, and kind of particularly of parents, but then also when you think about poor support and support for people with learning disabilities more widely, there's also a sense that, these conversations are not rooted in a system that is particularly good at supporting people with learning disabilities. So often that can add to that difficulty in having these conversations and things like that. So I've got a couple of examples of what things that people said in the PhD, and the first one is from a guy called Alex. Well, they're pseudonyms, but a guy called Alex in this presentation. And he said, I feel like we've got closer recently because you understand that obviously when my mum and dad go, I'm going to be the main carer for Lola. So it's gone from obviously being like a teenager going out to now I'm an adult and I need to start. And the interesting thing here is that Alex was quite young in my sample. I think he was sort of 21, 22. But for him, it really felt like this, he'd had his teenage years, he'd gone out and that kind of stuff. And now he needed to start thinking about this. And particularly for him, it was about learning how to support his sister, and sort of, again, he'd rejected that young carer stuff and young carer groups when he was younger. He'd never really considered that, but he really felt, even in his early 20s, that he needed to kind of start thinking about this a bit more, kind of, in his words, seriously, I guess you could say. And then moving to a participant who was a bit older in my sample. So he was the oldest participant we had, he was 32. And for multiple reasons, including his age, he felt closer to this being a more real kind of transition. I think not to undermine what Alex was talking about, but Alex's discussions about this were a little bit more abstract. He didn't quite have an immediate sense that this was going to happen anytime kind of in the next 10 years, for example. But for Scott, it felt a lot more immediate. And he said, now is more sort of the background knowledge that there's this situation you're going to be responsible for and what it means for my own life choices and things I want to do. I feel like a good 50% of conversations is talking about the latest shit with my brother, not him, but like his care and things that are going wrong and things they're having to sort out and things that aren't going well and reasons why he's stressed out or his health and those kind of things. And that's a lot of that is a case of shit support rather than him as a person. But yeah. Um, so there's a few things about this, and this is kind of like particularly a quote that I would say shaped coming to build that research bid that we ended up kind of being successful in getting this project. But that real sense of sort of anxiety and frustrations about what was to come, and the idea of like this relentless sense of like what's coming isn't going to be good, and that it's really hard to think about this because the support's not great. Every time I speak to my parents, they're kind of talking about stuff that I know I'm going to have to do quite soon. And for Scott, there was also an element of kind of he lived up north, his family lived down south, but he had a real sense that even though he had this whole life that he felt was pretty settled in the north of England, he'd probably have to move down south and kind of start supporting his brother more actively down there because again, he just didn't have he didn't really trust if he wasn't there that things would go to plan. And that's sort of what his parents were saying as well. And I also really like how Scott holds back from sort of like putting any sense of emphasis on his brother in this. I think there's a couple times where he nearly kind of says like later shit with my brother, but then goes on to say like not him, but like his care and stuff. And I think you get a real sense of how wider structures can kind of inhibit how people with learning disabilities and their siblings can have their relationships and how, you know, individuals are not at fault for most of this stuff or any of this stuff, I should say. And often systems are putting a lot of pressure on people that are kind of impacting their relationships. And when you think about kind of what Meltzer was saying at the start about those deficit narratives and then the things that we talk about in sibling relationships, I think it's always important to kind of point out those moments where people aren't being individualizing, they're not pathologizing their siblings, they're kind of really clearly recognizing that there's other things at play here. So just before we get into the project, I kind of guess it's worth flagging this question of choice as well. So across all this data, there was a sense of a lack of choice, both for the people with learning disabilities and for the siblings of people with learning disabilities. So I was obviously speaking to siblings of people with learning disabilities, and I was getting this sense that they didn't really feel like they had a say in what they were going to do in the future, and that it would be quite a big impact on their life, for example, as Scott was saying. But you know, there wasn't really any other options. They were going to have to do it. And then when you go and kind of read about this, there's some really interesting papers like the one I've cited there that also make this point, of course, for people with learning disabilities and the idea that, you know, sibling care, for example, in later life is really common, but it's really rare that people with learning disabilities are asked if they want their sibling to be kind of in charge of their care or managing their care. And that's, you know, it works for some people, it might not work for others. I'm kind of thinking here about Kirsty Lydiard's work on intimacy and disability, and she has this really kind of interesting and quite subversive story where she interviewed someone who talked about kind of their intimate relationships and not wanting their partners to necessarily have to care for them after they've maybe had an intimate interaction, so to speak, and things like that. And those ideas of people often not having a say in who cares for them and then just having to kind of put up with whatever it might be, and that actually having some relational implications on how they are and be with the people around them, which I think is really, really interesting. I also wanted to flag up the idea of like loneliness in later life, you know, all the stuff that unfortunately I've not been able to include in this presentation about how fun and humorous and silly and great sibling relationships can be. You know, if other factors are kind of putting pressure on that or putting strains on that, I think it's really interesting to consider, especially when we know that people with learning disabilities experience kind of quite a lot of loneliness in later life by the nature of some of the kind of care supports and things like that. So moving into the current project and the kind of hopefully interesting and exciting data. Wanted to start with this quote from the steering group from a parent carer. And I think it really sums up partly why these conversations aren't happening, but also the sense of need for these conversations. Because I guess that's sort of the other side of this whole discussion is, does this stuff need to be happening? And one of the parent carers said, we think everything will stay the same forever, but it won't. And that kind of idea that things might be going well at the moment, but actually you need to keep planning for the future because, you know, there will be a time when parents are no longer around to support and we need to be kind of thinking about what comes next. So the current project, kind of to get into a bit more of a methods and general summary of the work. So we're wanting to explore care transitions for adults with learning disabilities when primary carers, who are often parents, are no longer able to provide care. We're interested in understanding these transitions from all perspectives of the family with the hope of informing a larger project in the future. So a lot of this is about ethics and a lot of this is about how you can bring those different ideas and different kind of positions into conversation with one another to think about future planning and kind of recognizing that this is something that affects lots of different people within and actually outside of families, and just thinking about how to manage and do that work in a thoughtful and careful way. So we've got the phases on there. They look quite kind of separate, but they're all intermingled really in practice. But we have a steering group, so people with learning disabilities, sibling carers, well, siblings, and then parent carers, and that meets 3 times across the project. We're meeting with them next week for the second time, but we've met with them once already. That's also kind of they're also consented to kind of have their data collected during that. So it's not quite like a workshop for the project, but it means that when we get kind of quotes like we had at the start there, that was from the steering group, and we're able to use that and bring that in, which is really, really nice. We've got a rapid scoping review of academic and grey literature. So we're really interested in what academic work says about this topic, but also if there are any resources, what are the resources like? Are people accessing anything? That kind of stuff. And then we've got participant workshops. So we're speaking to people with learning disabilities, siblings, and then parent carers. And we're going to have two workshops with each of those participant groups. So that makes sense. So six workshops across the project. And we're kind of discussing again how care transitions could be better supported. Have they accessed any support? How do they feel about these care transitions? Stuff like that. And starting to think about what needs to be done in this area is kind of what we're really interested in. So I've got the research questions here. I won't like read them all out because they're kind of they cross over a little bit and there's some stuff. But I guess the really interesting thing I think in this project is particularly those ideas around thinking about the feasibility of bringing people together and thinking about kind of how you could do co-production, for example, with quite distinct strands. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that when you read about previous work that has done research with people with learning disabilities or parent carers. Sibling carers are very rarely involved, but like those groups, it's often done in silos, and it's quite rare that people are brought together. And that comes from kind of an understanding that people do have quite different stances, and like the sibling relationship, as I was saying at the start, it's quite different to a parent relationship and all those kind of things. So there's lots of moving parts to consider here, but I think really interested, and actually, as we'll come on to in some of the data, across the board, people have been quite excited about the idea of bringing people together to talk about this, and kind of the idea that everyone's stances on this could be brought in creative and interesting ways. So the scoping review really quickly, because I think it's important to think about this stuff, but it's less exciting than the data, maybe, if I can say that about the methods of my own project. So really interested about siblings in the scoping review specifically. There's, quite a lot written about, again, parent carers and people with learning disabilities growing older, but again, siblings are a real omission in data and or in research, I should say. Interested in whether there's any kind of specificity around sibling care, whether there's anything about the sibling relationship that comes out in some of this stuff. So we found 10 academic papers. We're in the process of we've done the data extraction and we're coding that. We've also got one grey literature document / resource, which interestingly, no one we've spoken to has accessed or used, but it's good to know it's out there, and it's kind of interesting to see that even though that is quite well signposted on certain websites, it doesn't seem to be necessarily getting into people's hands, at least the people we're speaking to, and that's an interesting finding in itself. So some early working themes identified, lack of support for future planning more generally, concerns about the future really kind of like commonly discussed in these papers, and then siblings being overlooked. So that's something that we're really interested in, and particularly papers sort of talking about siblings who maybe more actively do want to be involved in care, not always being kind of, if someone lives in supported living, not always being let into that kind of discussion and conversation in the way that maybe we thought. And actually, when you think about my PhD, the way that some of the participants seem to believe they would be in the future. So that's really interesting when people are sort of have an expectation of what it's going to look like, and then other factors can get in the way of that. So early findings of the data. So what we've done really kind of like just for the presentation, Elsie and I tried to kind of do something that would narratively fit together. And so what we've done is we've taken those early scope and review themes and we found data that we think kind of generally speaks to similar themes. And that's something that has been pretty common across the data anyway. But as I say, we're quite early into the analysis. So it's a little bit kind of haphazard. And as you'll see with some of the data, it doesn't exactly fit in what we're talking about, but I'm trying to kind of create some sort of narrative across the project because I think it makes for hopefully a more interesting presentation. But the fieldwork, yeah, has generated some similar themes, and those are lack of support for future planning, concerns about the future, and then siblings being overlooked. And then Elsie and I have picked out some pieces of data we find interesting from the workshop that broadly fit into those themes. And I guess I would say here again that, like we're pretty early into thinking about this stuff. So we're going to kind of pull out some stuff that's interesting to us, but also really kind of keen on if anyone in the audience sees something or anything kind of really speaks to them about the data, that's something we'd be really welcome to have kind of a discussion about. So getting into data, which is the bit that I hope is a bit more exciting than ins and outs of scoping reviews and whatnot. So these are all from our sibling carer workshop. And the reason that we presented that, I know it's quite a lot of data, we presented them together because broadly speaking, it was all around the same conversation. So sort of within the same question around had anyone accessed any support, what had people accessed, we got these three responses. And the top one I won't read all of them throughout this bit, but I will read that top one because I think it's really interesting. They said social services are, I don't like to put anyone down, but they seem pretty much non-existent, I feel. When you do contact someone, it's just black and white to them. They don't seem to care about our feelings. We just want the best for our brother or sister, a reasonable life. We know it's difficult with money. There is restraint on money for them. We want to lessen the burden on us. We want them to be in a safe environment. And I think there's something really interesting about how people are aware, obviously, of the wider constraints of what's going on, and they're aware of, the many moving parts that can inform the support their siblings receiving, but also that kind of final point around we just want to lessen the burden on us and we want them to be in a safe environment. And I'm always conscious of the word burden in discussions of care, but I also wanted to kind of leave the participants' words as they are. But I think in this case, it was more of a like an administrative burden, if that makes sense. I'm not saying that that's a direct distinction there, but there was something interesting about often it was about engaging with support workers and trying to get people to listen in a way that felt kind of a slightly distance from their sibling themselves, a bit like Scott at the start, where he was talking about this is a case of shit support. More generally, kind of ideas around not being able to find support that's really relevant to a sibling or relevant to the person with learning disabilities specifically, and trying to kind of find your own way through it was really, really common. There's no roadmap whatsoever in that final quote. This is something that came up a lot in the sibling group. And actually, as we go on and we talk about siblings being overlooked, this real sense that you're instantly kind of thrown into something where you're not supported. There's no recognition that you aren't a parent carer. You're not someone who's done all this stuff for a long time. Things look a bit different. And I really like at the end that final quote, this idea of transitioning from being a sister to being in this role is very, very hard. I want other people to have one document that they could pick up, a roadmap, links to other places. Tell people not to panic. These are the things to think about. It is terrifying. And across all the kind of conversations we've had, there's been this real sense that there doesn't seem to be a place to go where you can just get information that tells you what you need to do. And like we say, if these conversations aren't happening in advance of somebody potentially like needing to step in, then you end up in situations like this. And that use of the word terrifying is obviously really emotive, and it really captures that feeling of just being cut adrift and not having any idea of where to even start in supporting your sibling. But a lot of this again is rooted in that closeness and that kind of want for your sister or brother to kind of have a good life, or as somebody said at the start, a reasonable life. It's not a massive ask, I would say, what people are kind of hoping for and wanting for their siblings. So then concerns about the future. The top quote here is really interesting because it sort of talks to some of that stuff that they were saying um, in the last page about kind of the nitty gritty and what needs to be in that document potentially. So we've got things around power of attorney. This person's paid for their own funeral, but also is looking into paying for their um, child's funeral in preparation. There was a really interesting conversation that we didn't expect to come up around what would happen to people's children or their siblings actually if they kind of lived longer than them, and where like somebody had asked where would my brother be buried if I died before them? And they couldn't get an answer from anybody in social services. And they got really kind of really stressed and worried, understandably, about what that would mean for their sibling. And they ended up, similarly to this person, they'd already kind of pre-bought a plot and things like that. So we're getting a real mix of kind of more general structural concerns, but also more kind of everyday, just like little, not little, because that is a big deal, but smaller, mundane almost things about, well, what will this look like? And what will this look like? And this building a kind of bigger picture of how this support needs to be thought about. The second half of that top quote moves into a kind of space of a more general sense of concern around how people with learning disabilities are treated in the UK and what this means for how people understand what's going to happen when they're not around to support their children. And this was something that we didn't actually really anticipate coming up in the way it did. But at the bottom there, they say, are they going to go back to the old ways, or we end up with them in these big buildings, like in the old days where they're just lumped together and forgot? And then this was an organization which supports parent carers, and one of the participants in this workshop was both a kind of support worker at that organization, but also a parent carer. And they said, institutions, that's a big fear for our parent carers as well, the Winterbourne effect. And this was something that came up in the sibling carers as well. And that's kind of really interesting and really kind of unexpected thing that actually like because of some of the really terrible things like Winterbourne View and stuff that have happened to people with learning disabilities in the UK in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, that people, both siblings and parent carers, have a real sense of concern about what will happen if they're not there to support their child or their sibling, and what the kind of a concern or a question mark around what support services would do to their family member without them involved to kind of support and look after them. And that's, I think there's something really interesting here about how you begin to build a support service around that, if that's where people are coming at it from, and those kind of ideas that have come up more than we anticipated coming up in our interviews and in our focus groups. But I really recognize that that's a really kind of like heavy topic. So I wanted to bring in this example from a self-advocate as well, that hopefully moves us into a slightly more hopeful place. And this was about the idea of how we could have these conversations and should we be having these conversations. And one of the self-advocates in our steering group talks about the idea of working things out together and the idea for them that this is something we can solve if we start talking about this and we start thinking about building resources and planning a bit differently for the future. So I sort of really didn't want to leave this slide in just a place of like it's absolutely terrible and nothing can be done about it. But I also think it's worth recognizing that there's a big job on people's hands here, I guess, to address and think about this. And then siblings being overlooked. And this is a really long quote again, but I kind of couldn't really cut it down. It just felt like it had so much good stuff in and it spoke to all the stuff we've been talking about so far. But in terms of the sibling being overlooked bit, it's a bit messy, this one, but it's sort of that idea of siblings need support because I know a lot of people mention their parents don't want to entertain a conversation about the future. And ideas around siblings maybe being more open or being at least the siblings we spoke to felt that they tried to open these conversations up and not necessarily have been supported to do that, or families hadn't felt more comfortable. There's also a really interesting point here about independent advocacy or social work and the idea that actually for this sibling carer, they couldn't say if this was something that maybe a social worker should open up this conversation or whether we needed to think a bit more alternatively about where those conversations could be happening and how we support those. And again, I think that tied into more generally those ideas of families not necessarily always trusting more formal support services because of experiences they've had or experiences more widely going on that I think are really interesting when you think about how we can navigate these challenges and talk about them. And then that bit at the bottom, I know someone in the older SIBS group who is just left between having to do everything themselves, trying to get things going between different council areas and just getting zero support. So again, kind of throughout this, a sense that some of the siblings who were now kind of primary carers for their brothers or sisters still feeling like they just couldn't access any support. We also wanted to kind of do an interesting things to note point about some stuff that we've been sort of picking up on and talking about that hadn't neatly, so to speak, fit into some of those other themes. The first one is about the squashing of family carer in research and in support. So all of the siblings that we spoke to basically have talked about finding nothing for siblings, but finding a lot for parents and suddenly feeling like they had to kind of navigate parent resources, but with their sibling kind of mindset on. And then we got some really interesting and quite I guess, relationally interesting quotes about like, I'm not treated as a sibling, I'm treated as my brother's parent. I'm expected to do everything that a parent is expected to do. We are suddenly surrogate parents. And this idea that for siblings, this was something that they didn't want to be seen as because they were really kind of, they were happy and enjoyed being a sibling as opposed to a parent, if that makes sense. I know that sounds a bit ridiculous, but I think it has kind of relational implications for how they understand their brother or sister. And I guess if you think about the kind of paternalizing and potentially patronizing treatment of learning disabilities in that, people with learning disabilities, I should say, in that ideas around whether your kind of sibling becomes your parent when your parent dies is a bit infantilizing maybe, or something that's worth considering in some of these spaces. And then that question of what role do support workers play in this? So a couple of quotes there. I think, this is something that we're really playing with and talking about in the project, but really struggling to kind of work out how you would do this in a way where people felt supported and trusting to have these conversations and to think about these things. And I don't know, I just don't, yeah, I don't know what that looks like. And I don't know how you begin to do that, but we wanted to flag it because it keeps coming up. Particularly that final quote, I think is really kind of interesting and moving around some of this stuff. But that idea of like, any support that I found has been very parent focused. I've even thought about not changing my last name so that local authorities know that I am his sister and that we are related. Like this idea again that everything is sort of a decision that has way more weight on it than you initially might think because people are so concerned about what might happen if they're not, you know, have the same surname, whether they'll be shut out from discussions and things like that. It's really interesting, some of that stuff. So where next, just to wrap up, I think more work needs to be done that recognizes sibling relationships as nuanced and complex in the context of care and social care provision. So that idea that there's something about sibling relationships maybe that does distinguish it from parent relationships, and needing to kind of think about that in the context of social care. And then often research looking at the future is done in silos with people with learning disabilities and siblings of people with learning disabilities, often overlooked in social care spaces. So I'm really keen to kind of think about the ideas of how you can bring people together and make sure that you're having conversations that allow the sibling relationship to be kind of supported, to be flourishing, or whatever word you want to use, as opposed to kind of separate and pulling it apart in a way. But that's kind of where we're at in the project. And I know that was a bit of a rapid roll through of a lot of different ideas, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Not at all, Tom. It was really, really carefully presented. Thank you so much. So much.